Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellbite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to finally release my guide on how to counter Hwei, our newest champion. Now, Hwei is one of the most complicated champions that Riot have ever created, and accordingly can be an absolute nightmare to face. When one champion has 9 basic abilities, how do you fight back against that? Despite this, however, Hwei has plenty of avenues for counterplay, provided you know what he's up to and can react accordingly. Now, this does mean that Hwei is very difficult to counter and does rely on a lot of meta-knowledge about how Hwei himself works, so I will cover the basics as we begin. I will talk through some general counterplay tips on dealing with Hwei, we'll talk through each of his abilities and how to counterplay them, and then I'll conclude by giving you guys some counterpick advice. First up, keep an eye on Hwei's current mood. He has to enter a mood, or stance, before being able to use any of his basic abilities. Think of this like a spellbook type champion. The first button press of Hwei opens a spellbook. Depending on what button he presses, it has a different effect. It's orange for damage, blue for utility, and purple for CC. And then after that point, he has to press a separate button to cast a spell from that spellbook. Let's say, for example, he can tap QQ to use his Devastating Fire ability. Once he's done that, he can't cast anything from that spellbook until after the entire ability has come back off cooldown. That means that his QW and his QE are no longer available the second he casts his QQ. This then immediately gives you a way to kind of counter him in a couple of different ways. First, by paying attention to what mood Hwei is in, you can know what he's about to attempt. Again, orange is damage, blue is utility, and purple is CC. Sometimes it's difficult to tell this, especially if Hwei is using his one and only skin at the time of recording, Winter Blessed Hwei, but he still poses very specifically depending on what stance he's currently in. In damage stance, he holds his paintbrush up over his shoulder with the tip up. In utility stance, he holds his brush at the waist with his tip trailing behind him. And in crowd control stance, he holds his brush out in front of himself like a sword. These tells work for his default appearance as well, and I would expect them to carry through to all of Hwei's future skins, so you can always use at least the physical positioning of Hwei to tell what stance he might be in, and therefore what he might be planning to do if you can't use the color cues, as I know they're a little bit difficult to tell on his default appearance. The other major thing that the spellbook approach to casting abilities has is that Hwei has a ton of opportunity cost to using an ability. If Hwei uses something and whiffs, not only has he denied himself value from that ability, but he's also shut himself out of 2 other abilities at the exact same time. If he throws out a QQ and misses, that means not only has the QQ missed, he can no longer use his QW or his QE against you. This then means that you no longer have to worry about counterplaying those other 2 abilities on top of the one he just expended. You only have to worry about all of his W spells and all of his E spells. And while that doesn't sound like a big deal, it is a big deal to help relieve the mental load for actually dealing with everything that Hwei has at his disposal, because that there is a ton of things. Also, Hwei having to press 2 buttons to cast an ability means that Hwei is notably slower at using his abilities than other champions. This is not only because he has to physically press 2 buttons, but also he has to be very deliberate about the buttons he's pressing. He doesn't want to make sure he spams, for example, because if he's pressing QQQQQ to get into Q stance, then he has an accidental opportunity to cast his QQ spell and not the one maybe he was reaching for. As a result, you can use this to your advantage. Not only does this mean that Hwei's DPS is just a little bit slower than other champions because he just physically can't cast abilities as quickly as other champions can, but it also means that if you can panic a Hwei, this is going to work best against inexperienced Hwei players by getting in their face or forcing them to make tough decisions, that they will panic, that they will misinput abilities or use the wrong ability in the wrong place or spend so much time thinking about the order they need to press their buttons in, but that by the time they finally get to it, it's already too late for them. This is something that you will be able to exploit against Hwei players below a certain degree of mastery because they just will not have the reactions or the muscle memory built up in order to figure that out. Finally, Hwei is exceptionally squishy and fairly generalist. He does poorly into any champions that can get into range to burst him, and any damage you do hit him with will stick. Additionally, because he's so generalist, he has a lot of tools, but he's not very good at doing any one thing in particular. As a result, he's going to get out-DPS'd by dedicated DPS mages like Ryze, Cassiopeia, and Karthus, and outranged by artillery mages like Xerath and Ziggs. As a result, if you know what your advantage is against Hwei, play to that strength. If you are Xerath, never be in range of any of his abilities besides his QW. If you can do that, a lot of Hwei's value just kind of evaporates immediately. But let's go on and talk about his specific abilities and how you can outplay them, and buckle in, this section is going to be a long one because Hwei has 9 basic abilities plus a passive plus an ult. Do keep in mind, again, that Hwei's abilities are in groups of 3, meaning that if he uses one, the other 2 are offline until the stance comes back up. First up, Hwei's passive, Signature of the Visionary. Despite ostensibly being a 3-hit passive, Signature of the Visionary procs as soon as Hwei hits you with 2 separate abilities. This is not a 3-hit in that he needs to land 3 abilities, it's 3-hit in that he lands the first 2, and the 3rd hit comes through from the passive. This means that if you've taken a single hit from a single ability, like his Severing Bolt, you can play a bit safe until the mark wears off, lest you accidentally let Hwei trigger his passive. Hwei's passive is also AoE. This means that you should get away from friends whenever possible if you've already taken Hwei damage in order to prevent the signature from accidentally damaging your friends at the same time. I believe this ability is technically dodgeable if you have godlike reflexes and also a dash that puts you an insane amount of distance away from the AoE. I wouldn't worry too much about dodging it, but it is theoretically possible. At the very least, there is a delay allowing you to react to seeing the passive come down before you're automatically dead to it. First up, we'll talk about Hwei's Q abilities. The theming on these is that they're all damage focused. This means that if Hwei uses one of his Q abilities, these are the orange buttons, that he no longer has access to his primary damage tools. Hwei's QQ is Devastating Fire, which is an exceptionally reliable damaging ability because it's fast, explodes in an area of effect upon striking a target or at max range, so he can hit you behind minions if you're standing too close to them, or if you just happen to be outside of range, but just outside of range. And it also deals % max health damage, so it will always be a relevant button. Regardless, if you keep units between yourself and Hwei, just don't stand too close to those units, as aforementioned there is an AoE explosion, but if you keep units between yourself and Hwei, this ability becomes much less reliable, which forces Hwei to rely on his more telegraphed QW and QE for damage instead. If you're standing in between minions, for example, it might not be possible for Hwei to actually land a QQ against you. Hwei's QW is Severing Bolt, and this ability sucker punches a ton of players. Hwei is relatively mid-ranged as a rule, but this single ability has a range measured in screens. As a result, keep on your toes after escaping from a Hwei when you're at low health. Just because you're out of range of his other abilities doesn't mean you're safe from this one. He can be in the middle of mid lane and still hit you underneath your tower. He can be like halfway down the river and hit you in the pixel brush. Like, this ability's range is crazy, so do keep this in mind when you're trying to deal with Hwei. Think of Hwei like Xerath. Just because he's no longer on the screen doesn't mean he can't hurt you. If you're low, back off further than you think you need to. This ability also deals bonus damage to crowd-controlled or isolated targets, which means that if you're sticking next to minions, not only can you help counterplay his QQ, but you can help counterplay the QW because it becomes a lot harder for Hwei to hit you, and only you, with his QW. Hwei's QE is Molten Fissure. This ability is pretty telegraphed, but it applies what's effectively a mini Rumble R to targets in the area of effect, so don't stand in it. There is a slow attached to this as well, so even if you're okay with taking the damage, the slow may mess you up regardless, so just try to avoid this ability overall, but you should see it come out not only from the indicator, but also the line of explosions that it triggers first. The explosions deal the most damage, so you do want to avoid being there as the ability comes out, but there is still damage over time afterwards, so again, just don't stand in this and you'll probably be okay. Hwei most often uses this to wave clear, but if he's doing so, it means he's missing his long-range harass and his reliable damage until he gets his damage stance back up, so you can step forward in order to punish him for being down his primary damage tool if he's just QEing the wave off cooldown. We move on to Hwei's W abilities next, which are blue and are utility focused. These three all will share the same button. If he uses one, the other two are offline. First up is Hwei's WQ, which is Fleeting Current. This ability deals no damage. I don't think I'd need to specify this, but a lot of Hwei players cast it like it does. Don't get suckered. It doesn't do any damage. And this ability is surprisingly effective at letting Hwei reposition. It's quote-unquote just movement speed, but it provides a surprising amount of movement speed. And for an immobile mage, it can be an absolute godsend. Hwei can be surprisingly slippery later in the game when his cooldowns are lower, because he can spam this to let him quickly traverse the map, get out of sticky situations, all those kinds of things. And this also obviously applies to his whole team as well if they're nearby. If possible, when you're going to gank Hwei, wait for him to use another W ability, probably his WE, before fighting him, because that way he doesn't have this button available for him to try and escape you with. Next up is Hwei's WW, which is Pool of Reflection. This ability constantly applies a shield to targets in the area of effect. As a result, anyone getting shielded by this is surprisingly tanky. Accordingly, don't get jebaited by this. If you're dueling a Hwei while both of you are low health and he pops this ability, do not try to DPS race him, you will lose. I've been at like single-digit health before with this on me and an Ignite ticking, and the Ignite did not kill me, because that's how much shield it gives you every second. It's kind of crazy. The area of effect, however, does not move with Hwei, which means that if you can force him off the pool through either displacements or just threat of more damage landing, it can prevent him from benefiting from it at all. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with this. Hwei's WE is Stirring Lights. This ability gives him bonus magic damage on his next 3 auto attacks or spell hits, but it's mostly relevant due to giving him mana back for each successful proc. This ability is a bit of a trap for Hwei players. You have to use it to compensate for the relatively high mana cost that his abilities all have, but if spamming it keeps his WW and his QW offline, which makes him a lot more vulnerable. If you pay attention, you can look for Hwei to have 3 orbs around him when he casts this. Once you see them, he's committed to the WE and therefore may be more vulnerable. Finally, we come to Hwei's E abilities. These are all his crowd control abilities and are themed purple. First up is Hwei's EQ, which is called Grim Visage, and this ability is probably Hwei's most impactful ability if you're trying to deal with him, because this is his best defensive ability. It's a Fiddlestick Sphere that's a skill shot, so you can dodge it, it's not guaranteed to land, but it also interrupts dashes, and this is huge for Hwei. If a champion is trying to dash onto Hwei at either point-blank range, where Hwei can see them coming and see the dash start to wind up, or if it's a long-range dash, something like a Nefiri W, for example, Hwei can just throw out the EQ and immediately stop that dash in its tracks. Now, obviously, this is harder for inexperienced Hweis to do because they may not see it coming, but it is something to keep in mind if you're playing against an experienced Hwei who will know that they can use this to stop things like a Talon Q or a Pantheon W from actually hitting them, and then be able to punish you with damage immediately afterwards. As a result, if you see Hwei use this ability fishing for just the Terrify, or if he uses any of his other E abilities, that's your opportunity to punish. If Hwei uses an E ability, and it's not EQ, and it's not to get you off his face, go get in his face, because that's his best way of getting you away from him. Hwei's EW is Gaze of the Abyss, and this ability I see Hwei players use the least. It's decently powerful, but it's mostly as a way to prevent action from happening rather than as a way for Hwei to make plays on his own. This is kind of the ability defined by its by just not doing anything. It sends out an eye, the eye reveals the AoE, and then if a champion is nearby, the eye can theoretically dash after them for a damage and a root, but the dash can be dodged, it can be body blocked, and because you have to be relatively close to the eye in order to get the dash to trigger in the first place, there's just not that much that this ability realistically does. Hwei can use this to scout is sort of the major thing you should be worrying about, but if he is using that, that means his EQ is off cooldown, and as we mentioned, that's an opportunity to punish if he doesn't play safe. Finally, Hwei's EE is Crushing Maw. This is another one of Hwei's more niche abilities. I see him mostly use this as a way to wave clear in conjunction with his QE and WE. The ability does let Hwei set up his other abilities, and it can pull multiple champions together for area of effect abilities like his QQ or R, so just try to keep them apart from each other if in a team fight in order to prevent Hwei from sucking you in with this ability. The cast time on this is relatively quick, but the CC duration is light, and as a result, you can attempt to punish Hwei if he uses this, even if it lands, because it just isn't going to CC you for very long. EQ is much better in that circumstance. If Hwei's using it in that circumstance, he's probably pretty bad. Finally, we come to Hwei's ultimate, Spiraling Despair. This ability is a skill shot, which means that Hwei can miss, and since it's relatively telegraphed and slow, a long-range ultimate is difficult for Hwei to land without the proper setup. However, once it's landed, there's nothing you can do for the person hit. They will take the full damage, but you can of course mitigate it with heals and shields, or negate the final explosion with an invulnerability or untargetability move. Most importantly, if you're hit by this ability, get away from your friends. The damage and slow can quickly add up, so do not share this ability with your friends. My playgroup personally uses the callout "I have depression" for anybody hit by this, so if you hear that, or whatever you guys happen to use, move away from the affected player so you're not sharing your depression with your friends. Finally, let's talk through some counter picks for Hwei. First up, Assassins. They almost all universally have a field day with Hwei. Obviously, he has some tools to assist him in this scenario, but most Assassins can take significant amounts of Hwei's health bar before he can cough up a single ability. Again, he has to press multiple buttons before using a singular ability. You do not want to play Assassins with telegraph dashes, like Nefiri, as mentioned before, because they can be interrupted with the EQ, but you can instead use Assassins with blinks or uninterruptible dashes, champions like Zed or Katarina, where realistically, by the time you've appeared on his face, you've pressed all your buttons. Even if he EQs you at that point, it sort of doesn't matter. Assassins with quick dashes like Talon and Pantheon can find success against less practiced Hwei players, especially if you're able to start the dash while you're within a minion wave. If Hwei tries to EQ you, if he's not queuing properly, you can potentially reach him, and the EQ may hit a minion before you actually land on his face for the damage, but that's a little bit less reliable against experienced Hwei players, so do keep the experience level of the Hwei player in mind before you choose a champion like that. Tangentially related to Assassins, engage-focused champions can absolutely give Hwei a miserable time. Champions like Hecarim, Malphite, Ornn, Leona, they all can get in his face to lock him down and kill him in short order unless he gets support from his team. As alluded to above as well, more specialized champions can beat Hwei if they can force a preferred scenario. Ryze and Cassiopeia can out-DPS a Hwei that they're able to close on, and Xerath and Ziggs can out-poke a Hwei from beyond his range. He's squishy as a rule. He can't take much damage in general, and his mana bar will quickly exhaust itself unless he's getting value from his WE. As a result, these champions can find success, especially like a Conqueror Cassiopeia who's able to land a Q or land a W, run down Hwei, because worst case scenario, you eat a fear and that's fine, you can walk away after that point. Best case scenario, you just kind of out-trade him because he just does not have the DPS to deal with you at that point. Finally, one thing Hwei is missing from his extensive toolbox is a cleanse. Therefore, hook supports, like Thresh for example, can give him a miserable time if he shows up in the support role. Hwei's EQ is very good at stopping enemy champions from dashing onto him, but can't do anything for him if he gets hooked. So Dredge Lines, Death Sentences, and Zenith Blades are all very effective ways at dealing with Hwei because you can lock him down, and again, he's super squishy, and he can die in very short order. But those are my tips for how to deal with Hwei. You guys, you'll have to let me know what you think of this video down in the comment section below. If you have any other thoughts about how to deal with Hwei, I'd love to hear your feedback down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I will talk to you all later.